There's new polling this morning in the Democratic primary in the race for mayor of New York. The latest Spectrum News New York One Ipsos poll has Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams at 22%, former presidential candidate Andrew Yang at 16%, former city sanitation commissioner Catherine Garcia at 15%, city comptroller Scott Stringer at 10%, civil rights attorney Maya Wiley at 9%. 16% of New Yorkers are still undecided in this poll. Early voting starts Saturday. Primary day is 2 weeks from today. As for the issues, 46% of likely voters say crime should be the top priority for the city's next mayor. That comes in ahead of the economy, affordable housing, COVID-19, racial injustice, and homelessness. Joining us now, former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. He's the author of the new book, The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America, out today. Also with us, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Good morning to you both. Commissioner, good to see you. You got a rave in the New York Times this morning, I see. Congratulations on that. Let's talk about that poll we just saw. You were the commissioner of police in this city. What's going on in the ground, and how important is it to the cops that we get a handle on it again?
It's ironic how quickly crime has risen to the #1 issue, literally in the space of a year. Brings us back to the 90s in many respects. All of these candidates are going to be challenged by that issue because the circumstances are very different now in 2021 than they were back in 1994, or for that matter in 2014 when I worked with Mayor de Blasio.
So what's going on? We've heard that the pandemic contributes to this. A lot of people have said that. But what's going on a policy level that's leading to this spike in crime?
On the policy level, the police have been pretty much told to stand back, hands off, don't get engaged. And you can understand why, that the public attitude toward the police right now is very frayed, that the trust that was there for a while is not there. And so we're in a tough spot. And the next mayor is going to have an incredible challenge trying to get the police to re-engage, trying to get the public to re-engage with them. And the issues of homelessness, the emotionally disturbed, probably more significant than any other time I've been familiar with New York City.
We've had a number of the candidates, Commissioner, on this show over the last couple of weeks. A lot of them have talked about getting mental health front and center along with police, getting social workers involved in some of these calls. I've asked them, just as a practical question, what that looks like. Phone call comes in, 911 call, right? The guys go out in their cruiser, the two officers go out. Is there a social worker in the back seat? And some of them said yes. How do you integrate mental health into policing if that's not the answer?
The devil's going to be in the details, and I don't think any of them really fully understand how complex this is going to be. In L.A., when I was chief there, we had Smart Cars, which was a police officer with a clinician that would go to these calls. But police are always going to have to stay involved in some way. So trying to put it together is going to be an extraordinary challenge. Nobody's quite figured it out. Some countries have specialized units that respond to these all these calls. With 3,000 calls a day in New York City, you're going to have to set up an amazing bureaucracy separate from the police. Where's the money going to come from? With a $3 billion budget deficit projected for next year, the mayor's going to have major challenges, the new mayor.
And Joe, interesting to note that it is a former New York City police officer at the top of that poll we just read.
Yeah, exactly. In crime, again, 46% of Democratic primary voters in New York City say crime is the top issue. Mr. Mayor, I just want to read a little bit from this Times review. It says, succeeding as a centrist in public life these days, it can almost be an impossible task, but centrism in law enforcement may be the most delicate challenge of all. Bratton's ability to practice it was a startling phenomenon, engaging a remarkably candid account, a veritable encyclopedia of police tactics and culture. That's about as good as it gets as far as the review goes. I want to talk about that centrism, though. It does for a lot. If you go on Twitter, if you hear a lot of the ground noise out there, nobody wants a centrist. Everybody has these extreme solutions, one side or the other. Talk about the importance of centrism as you look at policing, as you look back at your career, what you did in New York, and what you were able to do even more effectively in Los Angeles, getting tied with the community that you were policing.
Joe, centrism is where success is achieved, that every one of these candidates has moved very far to the left. They're going to have to get back to center on a lot of these issues. That's the reality. As a police chief, police commissioner, I always liken myself to that juggler at the end of the old Ed Sullivan show back in the 50s and 60s, balancing all those plates. And the idea was to not have any one of them fall. Fortunately, throughout my career, very seldom did some of them fall. And that was with the help of a lot of other people who basically came in to help juggle those plates. Next mayor is going to need a lot of help because there are so many issues. We're talking about crime, but crime is influenced by just about everything else that's going to go on in the city, the economy, the homelessness issues. So the next mayor is probably going to have the most significant challenge since the 9/11 crisis 20 years ago.
You know, in your interview with Maureen Dowd, I thought it was interesting you brought up the 1994 crime bill, and if you were a Democrat, then you had to apologize for supporting the 1994 crime bill. Of course, it's very interesting. People don't remember the environment under which that was passed, where 100,000 new cops were put on the streets. They don't remember how high crime was in the late 80s and the early 90s. And isn't it interesting that all of these criticisms come from the relative safety of, the lowest crime rate in 50 years? In 50 years. And so all these attacks come not only towards policies that have kept streets safe, and I'm not saying the entire 94 crime bill did. I'm just saying people seem to have relaxed a bit over the past couple of years and started to take a lot of things for granted that you did and others did, other commissioners did. And they took it for granted when crime was low. A year later, suddenly, most politicians are running away from some of these glib statements they were saying a year ago because they understand they need cops on the street. How do the police officers get off their back heels and get re-engaged in these communities in a way that allows for reforming? It finds this centrist path that you're talking about.
Well, there's an irony. The poll that was out last week that I saw, I think you reported it on your show, that the support for police has actually grown in recent months. It's up now, I think, around 68% from down around 61%. But there's an expression, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. People living in the 21st century are focused on how it was in New York, and specifically in the 21st century, as we came out of 9/11, around 17, 18, things were pretty good here. And that's the world that they saw. 90% fewer homicides, 80% less crime, very little disorder on the streets. So they've been for a rude awakening because in many respects we are rushing back to the 1980s. And then in terms of that crime bill, it also had the assault weapons ban, it had research, it had so much, and it was blamed for and this is something the Reverend Al, who's here, has spoken about, mass incarceration. Mass incarceration didn't begin with that bill. It actually began back in the 1980s with other bills that began that process. The reality was, starting in the mid-90s, we began to reduce the prison population. In New York City, in New York State, the jail populations are down phenomenally from what they were because the city got a lot safer.
You know, one of the things, when you bring up about the crime bill, one of the things that I think is effective that you have stressed, and you and I have agreed and disagreed on things, is community policing. I mean, when you were first commissioner here, you had a mayor didn't want you to talk to the community. You went to L.A., and my chapter of National Action Network there were praising you, and you and I started working together in L.A., and when you came back to New York, the first appearance you made was at National Action Network in Harlem. You came to our stage where people said Bratton and Sharpton are going to be talking, and we may not agree, but I think the fact that we, on other issues we do, the fact that you engage with the community has got to be the challenge of the next mayor, of how do you thread that needle to where you have the community involved in helping to fight crime. And I think that clearly people do not understand. Joe Scarborough and I talk about it all the time. There's no one that wants to see crime down more than blacks and Latinos, who are the ones that are victimized not only in situations that I fight with the cops, but by the robbers in the community. And they really need a balanced man, a balanced commissioner that understands to work with them.
Now, interesting times, and the idea of going forward, what the Reverend has talked about, community policing, partnership, police and community, discussing what are the problems they want to address, shared responsibility to address them, and the focus on prevention, not just response to crime. We made that mistake for 70s and 80s, but how do you prevent it from coming back? There's still opportunity for hope and optimism, but the next mayor is going to really have the hands full, not just in this city, but in the country, because this crime issue is throughout America at the moment, and nobody has really figured out at this time how to deal with it, with police disengaging, trust being lost, communities still riled up. It's going to be a very interesting time in American history.
Commissioner, it's been just over a year since George Floyd was murdered by Officer Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. What did you take away, not just from that moment in policing, but from the broader conversation we've had over the last 12 years about policing? What needs to change in your eyes?
I always try to find in the middle of the mess, if you will, some things that you can get out of it that are positive. Coming out of that is the fact that certainly something that Reverend Sharpton has championed all his life is trying to have the concerns of blacks addressed and acknowledged and dealt with. We're certainly seeing that, the largest movement, 20-some-odd million people demonstrating. But for policing, it's actually an opportunity, because it's clearly understood now the deficiencies in policing. So the defund the police movement, the foolishness of that phrase, of that term, you need to refund the police to train them to deal better with homelessness, emotionally disturbed, with race issues. I had, for a couple of years with de Blasio, I had unlimited budget to train my cops on implicit bias, on drug recognition, all the different types of drug issues, on reduced use of force. You need to spend money. You get what you pay for, is the expression. So out of George Floyd's death came a recognition of the black crises the last 400 years. But there's also, I think, a growing recognition that without the police, you're not going to resolve this issue.